Welcome to today's iteration of our series on ancient geopolitics. We're very pleased to welcome with us today Professor Taco Terpstra of Northwestern University, who is a professor of classics and history. And he's going to talk to us today about various aspects of economic statecraft in the ancient world. And here he is. Tell us a little bit about sort of how we can think about the growth of states and markets and the interaction between economics and politics in the ancient world.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for the invitation, Bill. Thanks for having me. Delighted to be here. Well, in terms of geopolitics and economics and growth and trade, all that hangs together to a very large extent. The Roman Empire is a very large place. It runs from where you are, Britain and England, down to southern Egypt, and from Morocco to Romania. It's like a political unit. That's unique in the history of the Mediterranean up to that point. It's never been united. And with that political unification come certain benefits, come certain advantages in terms of trade. It is, yes, a political unit, but it is also the Mediterranean and beyond has become one big economic unit, one big trading unit. So you see long distance trading flows going across this vast area. So the two are connected in that sense.
Yeah. So how does, I mean, Rome obviously takes a very long time to consolidate an empire, right? It doesn't just happen instantaneously, right? It goes
from centuries.
Yeah, from a very small city-state to sort of a group of areas in central Italy to growing sort of slowly over the whole Mediterranean. In that process, does that actually go hand in glove with the construction of a larger and larger trading space? Or are there points at which we see kind of an incongruity between the progress of political consolidation and economic consolidation?
It's a bit of both. I mean, a long distance trade between the various regions of the Mediterranean, even when they were still separate states, is something that predates the Romans. So it's not as if this was a completely fragmented area in terms of trade, and there was only sort of local bits of like world pools of trade going on in separate corners. And the Roman Empire happens, then it becomes one trading unit. So again, it predates the Romans, a certain Mediterranean interconnectedness, but it is certainly heightened once the Roman Empire becomes one political unit. And that's always fascinated me. It's what I started doing my research on. Long distance trade is something that I found typical of the Roman Empire, that I found characteristic of it. Again, even if it predated the Romans, but it is something that you clearly see increase under the Romans. And much of my previous research has focused on the question of, well, how do you do that in very practical terms? Because it's still a pre-industrial, pre-modern economy, pre-modern society, without internal combustion engines, without fast communication. So if I wanted to trade in one end of the Mediterranean, I wanted to trade with another end, or for that matter, the center, these distances are very large. How would I know about market conditions? How would I know about prices? How would I know that it would make sense to go over there and offer stuff for sale? How does that work in terms of if you split delivery and payment? By which I mean, I could load stuff on a ship, sail over to wherever, and sell it, receive payment, and then sail back. But that's not how advanced trade works. Like advanced trade works with the idea of markets. So I know there is a market somewhere. I get paid in advance and then sail down there and deliver the goods, or just a trading relationship, and I deliver goods, and it might be a while before I get paid. I mean, that's a completely normal occurrence in a functioning market. But how does that work over very large distances? How do I know I do not get cheated? How do I know what market conditions are like? How do I know what prices are like? How do I know I'm not being lied to? And what if there is a dispute, as inevitably happens with advanced trade? what if I get delivered goods that are subpar, that is just not the standard that I was expecting, or I get paid, but it's not the sum that I was expecting, and my trading partner disputes it, like, no, we agreed on this, and I say, no, we agreed on that. So there is a dispute over the contract, over what actually was agreed upon. Well, how do I take someone to court? Do I drag them like all the way, like halfway down the Mediterranean, or do I go all the way, like halfway down the Mediterranean to go to court with my trading partner? How does all of that work in practical terms? And the answer is quite simple, but there is really only way that that can work, and that is through trading networks. Like enforcement of contracts, traders actually delivering the goods that they have promised, actually paying what they have promised, can only work if there is an enforcement mechanism, and they can't just disappear into the vast realms of the Roman Empire and the Mediterranean. If there is an enforcement mechanism, and that enforcement mechanism cannot be the state simply is too small. That is not something that the state does. The state is not in a position to enforce contracts, nor is it something that the Roman state sees as its task to enforce contracts. So it has to be private. That enforcement mechanism has to be private, and it has to come from networks. So if you're part of a network of traders in whatever it might be, grain or olive oil or wine or high value products, and you cheat, you do not deliver, you do not pay, whatever it might be, you can get thrown out, you can get ostracized from that network. And if that network controls access to the trade that you're in, then you're out of business. So that is a very strong incentive for you not to cheat, and also potentially for traders and trading networks to keep their business clean, shall we say, because they're worried about their reputation, they're worried about their individual reputations, but they're also worried about the collective reputation. Right? Does this network of traders have a good name? And if there's a bad apple there, or several bad apples, and reputational, you get reputational damage, reputation suffers as a network. So there's an incentive then for the network to cut out the bad apples so that they might have access to trade flows again. So that is what a lot of my previous research has focused on, long distance trade, and how do you do it in actual practical terms.
And this growth of these kind of trading guilds almost, right? That then
they're in a sense guilds. So this has two sides. Right? On the one hand, it enables trade, or rather, it enables trade in a way, in a more sophisticated way. Right? Again, I could simply go over someplace in search of markets, make the rounds, sell some stuff, immediately get paid, and sail back to wherever I came from. That can be done, and that was done, but it's not very sophisticated. It's not a very efficient way of running a market. It's a much more efficient way of being aware of trading conditions, where there's a demand for something, and then go there with the requisite amount, the thing I can sell for the price that I want to accept. So for a sophisticated market, you need these kinds of networks. So on the one hand, they enable this kind of trade. Right? Trade is more sophisticated, can be larger in scale because of these networks. But on the other hand, and this is what you say, they're kind of like guilds, and they have the other side, the negative side, if you will, of also creating barriers to entry. I mean, in a sense, that is their whole point, right? Because there's a barrier to entry to the market. That works as an enforcement mechanism. If you then throw out a trader, that trader will be out of business. But that only works if that network has, to an extent, a lock on a corner of the market, which means barriers to entry, which means a less efficient market. So medieval guilds have come under fire in the scholarship for precisely that reason. And there's truth to that. There's absolutely truth to that. But my research at least has focused more on the positive end. So like, well, how else were you going to do it, right? There is simply no other way to do it other than through some sort of guild mechanism, if you will, some sort of network mechanism. Yeah.
I guess what intrigues me somewhat about this is one of the key debates in economic history in the 20th century was about the relationship between the growth of markets and the growth of states, right? And so if we go to, say, Karl Polanyi's work in the mid-20th century, looking back at modern European history, essentially, for the most part, his argument is largely that the extension of the market is kind of codependent with the extension of the state. And
Yes.
what you're finding on some level is that the market precedes the state, at least. That before the Roman state was very, very strong, maybe it never got really strong enough to actually be the enforcement mechanism across this vast territory for all these different kinds of markets. But certainly before it got anywhere near strong enough, already we saw the proliferation of these kind of trading networks or guilds or groups that sort of self-policed.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But you bring up an interesting point. It's not as if the state has no influence, right? In fact, it has been in my most recent book has been my argument that the existence of the Roman state, its coming into being, has a positive influence on long distance trade, has through state institutions and through the political unit that I started talking about when we started this discussion, has a positive influence. So yes, markets predate the state, and there is trading before there is state involvement at the very least. But states do have a positive influence, and I think it is interesting to see if you look at very long-term data, and I'm thinking here, for instance, of the number of shipwrecks on the bottom of the Mediterranean. It's long been known that that this is what has been pointed out since the 1980s, early 1980s, that there is a peak in the Roman Empire, right? So, and if we take the number of shipwrecks as a proxy for the number of ships that were actually crisscrossing the Mediterranean, and if we then take that as a proxy for the amount of trade that is going on, and let's just do that for argument's sake, then you clearly see this peak in the Roman Empire at the time when the Roman Empire is at its maximum extent. However, as interesting as that is, what is even more interesting, I find, is that graph of shipwrecks on the bottom of the Mediterranean is a bell curve that starts going up well before the Romans, more or less in lockstep with state formation, more or less in lockstep with states forming and then getting larger. So there is a process of state formation, obviously, in the Greek world. There has long been state formation in the southeastern quadrant of the Mediterranean. In the Greek city-states, you see city-states in the central Italian, in central Italy, the Carthaginians, and then slowly, these states get larger. And as they do, and you see the number of shipwrecks go up. So as there is state formation and as there is state consolidation, these states getting larger until they reach the largest state that the Mediterranean will ever know, which is the Roman Empire. You see that correlating with the number of shipwrecks. And again, let's just take that as a proxy for trade. Yeah. So that seems to suggest that states have an influence, that states somehow do something, even if they are not in the business, not the Roman state, but also not the Hellenistic kingdoms, or as far as we know, the Carthaginian state or the Greek city-states are not in the business of enforcing contracts. Yes, there are courts and there are law codes and there's all sorts of legal stuff. But that is not backed up by the state the way we see in our modern economy.
It's simply because those states are
bailiffs and police officers, and there's an enforcement mechanism by the state. That enforcement mechanism is not there. So despite the fact that there is a sophisticated legal infrastructure with courts and law codes and the whole thing, you still need to look at the enforcement mechanism. Where is that coming from? My argument being that is private, but it is these private networks who use the threat or the actual doing of it, of expulsion, ostracism, to keep traders in line.
Right. I mean, this also then touches on another strand that I was going to ask you about, which is this idea of how we measure growth of the economy or of trade, especially in the ancient context, right? So I know that you've talked and worked a lot on the differences between sort of Smithian and Schumpeterian growth and how we might think of those or measure those. How would we begin to think about those in the context of shipping in the Roman Mediterranean or any other context of sort of ancient economies that you can think of?
Well, Bill, that is a very complicated question. And there's really two questions. So like first, how do you measure it, and then where's it coming from? So let me try to answer that first question. It is very hard to measure. How do you measure growth really in anything? We don't have statistics. We don't have, well, attempts have been made, fairly credible attempts at calculating the GDP of the Roman Empire. I mean, it wasn't, it had an economy, it must have had a GDP. What was it? But we can't track change over time. I mean, there simply is no way that we can create a time series with, in which we can track GDP growth or decline the way you'd be able to do for a modern economy. So there are no statistics. Statistics there are none. So we need proxies. Now, I just mentioned shipwrecks. That can be used as a proxy. That is material from the archaeological record, because shipwrecks are archaeological in nature. And in general, the best proxy data, or the only credible proxy data, come from archaeology. Simply the amount of material in any given archaeological layer. Not sure if you've worked in archaeology, but I have, but potsherds mostly, but glass and metal and whatever else comes out of the archaeological record. Simply the quantity of it. Like the further you go back in time, do you see more or less of it, and you go forward in time, do you see more or less of it? Another fascinating data set that scholars have looked at is, believe it or not, lead pollution in the Greenland ice sheet. Metals are being mined for coinage, but also for, like, lead itself is being produced for construction purposes and for water management. Silver is being produced, and a byproduct of silver production is that it creates atmospheric lead pollution. Because don't ask me about the chemistry, but to create silver out of ore.
Yeah, the smelting process often.
Yeah, like, again, don't ask me about it, but somehow this involves using lead, and some of the particles find their way into the air, and they drift into the air and through the troposphere, I think. Again, don't hold me to this. They end up in Greenland, where they're captured in snowfall, and so you see these layers in the Greenland ice sheet, and if you drill cores in them, you can see how much lead pollution there was at any given moment in the past. And because of mining activity, and because of metallurgy and minting of coins, coins are part of the economy, that too can be used as a proxy for economic development. Let's just use that word. And with lead pollution, you more or less see the same bell curve that you do with shipwrecks. And if you look at individual sites, for the most part within the Roman Empire, you also see simply the amount of stuff. That's a technical term. In the archaeological record, also, for the most part, tends to display that kind of bell curve. Now, that's lovely. That's wonderful. But what kind of growth does that show? Because the argument could be made, well, it's extensive growth. There are more people around. There's demographic growth. More people means more people doing things, consuming things, producing things, which you will see in the archaeological record. Right, so there's growth, but it is extensive in nature, in the sense that people are not necessarily better off on an individual basis. There's simply more of them, and they're doing more things, which you will then see. So the more, and that there's demographic growth in the Mediterranean over sort of a long stretch of time. So the upward curve of that bell curve that I'm talking about, that is will be on discussion in the aggregate. The more interesting question, therefore, is there also intensive growth? Are individuals in the aggregate better off? And that is much harder to get at. Like that, how do you measure that? Um, Even if there is more stuff in the archaeological record relative to the growth of people, there might still be inequality. So either we're looking at extensive growth, simply more people, and it's a linear function with the amount of stuff we find, or there is actually more stuff than there is people. It's not linear, but there's a small number of people who capture most of the benefits,
Yeah.
which means that the majority population still is not better off. So how do you get at, without statistics, how do you get at those questions? How do you measure any of that? And this is ongoing research. This is like in terms of intensive growth is really the cutting edge. So you can look for one thing at animal bones. Animals seem to be growing larger, like Roman chicken and Roman goats and Roman pigs. They seem to be larger than, say, in the Iron Age or before. There also seems to be more of it, more animal bones in the archaeological record. Meat is very inefficient as a source of calories. You're much better off if you're constrained in your resources to consume the calories that come off the land directly yourself and feed them to an animal and eat the animal.
Yeah.
But meat is also highly valued by humans. Humans like the taste of meat. If they have a bit more to spend, if they are better off economically, they will consume more meat. Meat is highly income elastic. So you have a bit more to spend, you're likely to spend on meat. Your income goes down, there's a squeeze on your income, you're likely to cut down on meat. It's one of the first things. So it's a luxury. So in that sense, meat consumption and also the size of animals, like how much are those animals fed, how much resources go to those animals, can be used as a proxy for intensive growth. And then, of course, so maybe you were thinking this the whole time, well, what about the human bones? Because you can measure the length of the bones of the animals. And the science is imperfect because usually we don't have whole skeletons, so you don't have like one bone, which is then used as a proxy for the whole animals. But anyway, similar for humans. Yeah, whole skeletons have been excavated, but very frequently these are disarticulated skeletons, and we only have separate bones. So the thigh bone of humans have been used as a proxy to see if like what's happening to them. And when this research started being done 10, 15 years ago, the expectation was that the trends would follow the other trends I've been talking about, the bell curves, the stuff in the cultural record, and the shipwrecks, and the lead pollution, and the whole thing. And the animals, more of them, bigger animals, to find that wasn't true. The science isn't, but again, this is the kind of the cutting edge in terms of intensive growth. The science seems to be saying, the data seem to be saying that humans, as they were apparently better off materially, were getting shorter. Which is odd, right? So they're consuming more meat, presumably,
Yeah.
meaning more protein, which is one reason why people grow tall. They're not resource strained. They don't seem to be at a Malthusian ceiling, yet they're going shorter over time. This is odd, and that itself needs an explanation. And the answer that has been given is, well, as societies advance, they also become more urban. So the number of urbanites goes up. The percentage of people living in cities goes up. It's never a majority. And what is the urbanization rate of the Roman Empire? Like anybody's guess, but let's just say 15%. I think many scholars, maybe most scholars would agree with that. It depends on the area where you are. But anyway, many of the skeletons we find to come out of urban context. So what we may be seeing is an urban penalty effect. People moving to or living in cities where they are exposed to all sorts of pathogens that stunt growth. So yes, they may be materially better off. They may have all this stuff around them. They may even be eating more meat and bigger animals, but they're not spared the stunting effect of urban pathogens. Many of these diseases are density dependent.
Yeah. Well, and also
Right.
sanitation in cities as
So
well.
yeah, well, think of COVID, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We all had to stay apart and social distance and whatever
Or
else.
even the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages, people fleeing the cities to go to the countryside to stay away from
Precisely,
contact.
because
Yeah.
exactly, there's fewer people around, so it's safer there.
Hmm.
So the paradox of people getting shorter, despite the fact that they seem to be getting
Hmm.
better off, might be an urban penalty effect. It has been called the urban penalty effect. Um, so that was an answer to your first question, like
Yeah.
how do you measure this? I think to answer your second question, uh, on the assumption, and I think most, at least Roman scholars would agree, and I think most Greek scholars too, that there is growth, that there is extensive growth.
Yeah.
So there is more people who would do more things, which we see in the archaeological record, but there is also intensive growth. In the aggregate, people are actually getting better off. Yes, these are very unequal societies, and there is a small top segment that captures most of the benefits, but not all of it. So people are actually getting better off. Like ordinary people are getting better off. How do you create growth? Um, well, there's a number of ways to create growth, but you asked about Schumpeterian and Smithian effects. Smithian effects means that you get more efficient in what you do, like allocative efficiencies, specializations. So it's named after Adam Smith, right? Um, um, uh, the 18th century British economist. If you think of the pin factory, so people have specialized tasks within a pin factory, which means that they're more productive. Well, you can apply that on a macro scale, um, and have people focus individually on different aspects, different parts of the production process, which makes them more productive. You can think of economies of scale. You can have 1,000 little farms that are all growing olives and grapes and grain. But if you have like 300 of them growing grain, and another 300 growing olives, and another 300 growing grapes, and then we're left with 100. But anyway,
Yeah.
the economies of scale, you get more productive. You just focus on one crop. You get better at doing it. You produce more produce. You produce more stuff. And markets, of course, because if you're only producing now, first of all, monocropping was never going to be an option for an ancient farmer, but there's margins of pushing things. You can specialize more in something, like have more of your arable land devoted to a particular crop. Anyway, if you're producing more of it, you're producing more of it for a market, presumably. You're not doing it for your own consumption. I mean, you can have your own little family farm that's produced for your own little consumption, and that's fine. And that's obviously the case throughout the Mediterranean, Roman Mediterranean. But there are also farms that are producing, at least in part, for a market, an overseas market, which brings me back to all the stuff that I was talking about in the beginning. So it ties in with Smithian growth, right? If I'm producing for a market, then I need a functioning market. I need to know what prices are in a potential buying region. I need to know if I send my olive oil or whatever it might be overseas, that I do get paid, etc., etc. And we get big into all the aspects I've just been talking about of like, how do you actually do that? Like, how do you, in practical terms, how do you make a market function, a sophisticated market function? Not just spot sales, but like an actual long-term, long distance. How do you do that? Well, I've talked about that. The other way of creating growth, and this is named after Joseph Schumpeter, Schumpeterian growth, is to innovate, to make the production process more productive by creating new technology. More productive olive presses, water wheels, machines that do the work for people. You free up labor. You can use your capital, land more productively. Innovation. Now, again, on the assumption that there's growth in the Roman Empire, on the assumption that there is both extensive growth and actual intensive growth, people are getting better off. What type of growth are we seeing? Are we seeing Smithian growth? Is it solely Smithian growth? Is there also Schumpeterian growth? And most people, when they think about the Roman Empire, and this is certainly the view of my students, I've noticed, they think of the Roman Empire as this highly technologically advanced
Mm,
society, and they're not wrong necessarily. This is a highly technologically advanced society, and the Romans can do lots of wonderful stuff. Engineering, aqueducts, Roman aqueducts are rightly famous. To have an incline of, I don't know how many percent, like I can keep that up for like 100 kilometers. I mean, the engineering is amazing, and that's not the only thing they could do. In terms of construction, the Romans were, if nothing else, wonderful engineers. They're also innovative in other ways. In the law, for instance, and Roman law is
mm.
still is one of the great legacies of Rome. And yeah, that can be called innovation. That is innovation too. However, what the Romans do, with exceptions like Roman law, is taking something that's already in existence. Well, aqueducts are not a Roman invention; they existed, and make them better. Learning by doing, which is not strictly speaking Schumpeterian growth. Like Schumpeterian growth is really inventing something new, and like pushing out the production function, like really making your economy more efficient so that it can produce more with that innovation. And that you don't see. Name how many Roman inventions, like proper Roman inventions, can you name? Probably not very many. I can really only name one, that's concrete. Poured concrete is a Roman invention. Pozzolana sand is the basic ingredient. This is sand that the volcanic sand that is mined in Campania, and they did something to it, and they created concrete, including concrete that could set underwater, so you could pour it like in the sea, and it would set underwater, so you can create harbors with all the benefits and infrastructure, aqueducts, and like all the stuff that the Roman world is known for. There's glass blowing, which is invented in the East Mediterranean in the Roman period. Can we really say it's a Roman invention? Well, okay, fine if we must, but that's about it. And so the Romans are very good at learning by doing and taking something and scaling it up and making it better, but really inventing something new, not so much. It isn't an inventive society. This is not a society, the kind of society that we see in the later Middle Ages, or let alone the early modern period, where there's lots and lots of like inventions that come online and that alter the production function, push out the production function. Yeah, this is one reason I have been focusing on trade, because if you're looking at growth in the Roman Empire, it is really Smithian processes, much more than Schumpeterian processes, that drive growth, that drive the economy forward.
I mean, what about, though, and this is a sort of a segue also into another topic, but what about organizing the sort of process or politics of production differently, and changes in that over time that maybe even sometimes takes the Romans by a bit of surprise, I think, because, I mean, a sort of niche topic that interests me is the politics of land, in many different contexts, including in the Roman Empire. But I feel like a lot of literature about that sort of focuses on the fact that land reforms during the late Republican and very early imperial periods don't succeed very well in Italy, in large part because of two things. One being the import of grain from places as far away as Egypt, right? That makes grain farming and sort of subsistence farming not really as economical for many people. And then also slavery, right? And then sort of the widespread application of slave labor to the land and to other aspects of production changes fundamentally the politics, but also the economics of agricultural and industrial production. And so I know that you were perhaps interested in talking a little bit about the role of slavery in Roman growth. Maybe we could discuss that a little bit.
Sure,
And
sure, sure. Yeah, no,
more generally, these issues of sort of the interaction of long distance trade, political expansion, and slavery in the reorganization of production in agriculture, industry, or other sectors that might have had some bearing on this.
Yeah, I know. I'll come back to slavery in a second, but
Sure.
going off what you just said about land reforms and such, and I know that's an interest of yours. There's one element I like to add to that, and that's
Hmm.
inequality.
Absolutely.
So what got the Grackite brothers killed, despite the fact that they was blue-blooded as they come. It's their own social class. Like the rich were getting rich off of empire, and this booty and riches flowing into Italy in the Republican period, and it's making the Republican elite fabulously wealthy.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they do, of course, this is what aristocracies in the pre-modern world do, is invest in land. And yeah, then to suggest that that land might, at least in part, even if it's public land, might be redistributed, yeah, that's not going to go over all that well, and it didn't. But if you're familiar with the story of the Gracchi, and of course you
Yeah.
are, you will know that slavery plays a role in this story too. Supposedly, um, like soldiers are moving out of Italy and they're doing the conquering
Yeah.
for the Roman state, and slaves come in. And these are the conquered peoples, the people that the Romans have just defeated, and their women and children, and they're coming into Italy and being put to use in the production process, being put to use on the land. And the size of these flows have been debated. Get into a very complicated discussion about the demography of Roman Italy, like soldiers moving out and slaves moving in. Does that balance each other out? Is there demographic growth? Yes or no? And, leaving all of that to one side. On the larger scale, yes, the Roman Empire is a slave economy. I think it can fairly be called that. It's certainly a slave society, as of course all ancient societies were, with the Greeks or the Carthaginians or all of them, all had slaves. And slaves are being put to use in the production process. Now, if I tie that to what I was just talking about, Schumpeterian
Yeah.
growth, the argument has been made from very early on. Look, because there is a slave component within society, it's forced labor, coerced labor, and you can make slaves work harder than free labor, within reason, there is no need to innovate, right? If you want something heavy hauled, well, you've got slaves, and you want some onerous part of the production process done, well, you've got slaves to do that. So why would you innovate? Like, why would you spend time and resources? Because that's the bottleneck, right? To innovate, you need to tinker, you need to spend time, might not work, might not pay off. You're investing resources in innovation. Why would I invest resources in innovation if I have a slave labor force that I can use to do whatever it is that I would otherwise invent a machine for? Well, you don't. At least that was the argument. But you reflect on that, does that argument really hold much water? The argument, to a very large extent, presumes that slave labor is, if not free, and certainly very cheap. And it's not. I mean, slave labor and free labor are not perfect substitutes. There are very many drawbacks with slavery, with slave labor. Yes, free labor, you have to pay a wage. But if you, for whatever reason, are stopping the production process for a while, you just dismiss your laborers, you have no cost. Slaves, there's first of all the purchase cost, and you have to acquire them. And then you have to clothe and feed and house them and potentially supervise them so that they don't flee. Yes, you can work them harder. But if you have to stop the production process for a little bit, in your slave labor force, it's just costing money, it's just sitting idly. So in any case, slave labor is not free. So to have something done in the production process, there is still, it doesn't take away, let's put it that way, it doesn't take the incentive to innovate. In and of itself, slavery is not the barrier to innovation that scholars in the past have thought it to be. To which I add that labor in the pre-industrial world is cheap in general, right? Most of the labor force was uneducated. Most of the labor force was unlettered, could not read or write, did not have very many skills. An unskilled labor force, for the most part, is a cheap labor force. That holds true in the Roman Empire, that holds true in the Middle Ages, that holds true in Han China, that holds true anywhere. Pre-modern labor is relatively cheap as a factor of production. So slavery in itself is not that big impediment to, I'm not saying that it played no role, but it's not that big impediment to innovation that it has been made out to be. Which leads us back to the question of, well, if the Roman Empire is not a particularly innovative society, it might be technologically advanced, but through learning by doing and through applying what is already there, but not innovating. Why? That's a very complicated question. And before I can try to give an answer, let me just give you one example. So I mentioned watermills earlier, and there are watermills in Roman Empire. They existed before. Romans didn't invent them, but and you could mill grain, and you can do other things with them. There's evidence that there are ore crushers that are driven by water in the Roman Empire, but there are no windmills, which I think is the prime example, because the Romans could build, we've established that, and the Romans could sail, I think we've established that too. Well, put the two together, you got a windmill, right? Build a building with sails, that's a windmill. They never got that idea. The windmill is introduced into Europe from the Middle East, probably from Persia, in the Middle Ages, not invented by the Romans. Why? It seems like such a no-brainer to us now, but that idea never occurred to anyone. So why? Why is the Roman Empire not as innovative as the later Middle Ages, and certainly as the early modern period? I think a good argument could be made, and I myself have made that argument, that yes, you create a vast political and economic unit, but that also leads to a certain inertia. You might have markets, which to an extent, this is also something I started talking about very early on, that are kind of fragmented. You create barriers to entry with these trade networks. But there are no sort of competing regions within the Roman Empire. It's all one political and economic unit, the way you see in the fragmented world of the Middle Ages and also the early modern period, where the political landscape, you've got all these little states and bishoprics and that are all worried about being swallowed up by their neighbors. They're afraid of their neighbors. They're incentivized to have one over on their neighbors. They're incentivized to be productive and to be sort of on the top of their game. So it's this competition, this interstate competition between states, the individuals, the fragmented landscape that you see later in Europe, that actually gives it an advantage in terms of innovation. And the kind of advantage that the Roman Empire, for all of its advantages in size, did not have. Add to that people with heterodox ideas can go someplace else. This is part of the fragmentation argument, right? So if I have some sort of idea and it runs counter to whatever the established authorities in my little state are saying, I might get kicked out, but there might be a place for me in the next state over, which is not that far, and I might be able to develop my idea there. So you've got this interstate competition, and because the landscape is politically fragmented, the authorities in all these little states encounter an enforcement problem, a coordination problem in cracking down on ideas that they don't like. And we can think of the heliocentric view of the universe, for instance, which for religious reasons is offensive to very many people. But that idea never dies once it's expressed, because there is no sufficient coordination between the authorities in all these different states. Now, all of that the Roman Empire did not have. So on the one hand, fantastic, great, open market space, political, economic integration, long distance market, Smithian growth, allocative efficiencies, economies of scale, specialization, and all of that, but perhaps not so much Schumpeterian growth, because there is also an element of inertia and a lack of incentive to innovate.
And some of that lack of incentive is political as well as sort of structural or economic, then, no? In the sense that, if you can't just go to the neighboring state, I mean, the same way that the Habsburg Empire was very innovative in lots of ways, precisely because it was such a messy collection of little principalities.
Precisely.
Whereas, the French state at a similar time was less innovative because it was a highly centralized state.
Precisely. So yeah. So there is a payoff in terms of sorry, payoff. There's a drawback. Sorry,
Right.
to being a large territorial state. There's advantages. There's a Smithian advantage to it. There might be Schumpeterian disadvantages,
and vice versa,
and
because
vice
in
versa.
a fractured or fragmented state, it's much harder to feel secure. It's much harder to
Yeah.
be free from war. It's much harder to have enforcement mechanisms that work across large distances and
Yeah.
spaces.
Absolutely. Yeah. People
Right.
distrust one another. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. For religious reasons, political reasons. Yeah. Yeah.
So given that sort of tension, I want to ask you one final question, and then I want to get some questions in from the audience, of which we've got a few piling up. And by the way, everybody in the audience, please do, if you're interested in asking a question, type it into the Q&A tab, which should probably be at the bottom of your screen. We've got a few in the queue, which I will pose to Taco shortly, but I want to ask him one final question first, which is, several times we've talked about this kind of bell curve of growth and then decline of trade or economic activities, we might measure it. When is that decline in the Roman context? Is it roughly contemporaneous with what we could chart as a political decline of the Roman Empire, or is it earlier or later than that? Just as the start was earlier with the Carthaginians and the Greeks, or maybe the Phoenicians, of this trade growth in the Mediterranean, do we see the diminution coming maybe even later than what we would chart as sort of the latter periods of decline in the Roman Empire?
Well, that is an excellent question. In terms of the shipwrecks, I think the answer is becoming increasingly clear that the peak is at the peak of the Roman Empire, somewhere in the mid-2nd century AD. And as more data become available, because more shipwrecks are being found and published, the data are getting ever more fine-grained, and I think it's getting ever clearer that sort of mid-2nd century see peak of the Roman Empire, peak of its size is the peak. And for very many individual sites around the Roman world, the same holds true. You look at the archaeological record and the number of stuff, again, to use that technical term in the record, like what you see for the most part, that's mid-2nd century. In the mid-2nd century, a disease hits the Roman Empire, the Antonine Plague. And this is something about Smithian growth that I haven't mentioned yet, but Smithian growth, as wonderful as it is also very vulnerable. And we've seen this during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Because we have a hyper-connected economy, stuff from China coming in, and the production process is just like geolocated all over the place. Once that's disrupted, as it did during COVID, that has massive effects immediately. So on a much smaller scale, of course, you see something in the Roman Empire. That Smithian effect on the economy is very vulnerable. But anyway, back to your question. Is that true everywhere? No, well, kind of, sort of. East and West begin to diverge.
Yeah.
In the West, like Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, some extent also Italy, you see a decline, and that really sort of starts in the Northwest, West. One scholar compared it to a weather system that moves over the Roman Empire, demographically and also economically. And then that weather system, just use that metaphor, hits the East Mediterranean, Southeast later. So in the Southeast and East Mediterranean in general, things stay better longer, and to some extent even recover to the level and beyond of the 2nd century. So in the 6th century, there's parts, at least parts, not all of it, but it's not parts of Syria and Egypt where there is more economic activity, more people also, they're more densely populated by the looks of it. And then in the 2nd century. So in the aggregate, yes, the peak is in the mid-2nd century, where you'd expect it to be. This is the Roman Empire is at the height of its power, height of its geographical extent. But then it depends on what region within the empire you're looking at. Maybe somewhat earlier, somewhat later, depending.
And I guess the tiny little follow-up to that I'll permit myself is, to what extent is that so causing political issues or being caused by political issues? Because if we think of the sort of decline of the Western Roman Empire and then really, sort of golden age in some ways of the Byzantine Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries, right? I mean, Justinian and all these other things. And the fact that that goes on for another 1,000 years, and as you just said, sort of this decline doesn't really manifest in the East, even though it's manifesting quite sharply in the West at that point after the 2nd century. And I imagine even more sharply once we get to the 5th century.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But is that because of the political decay and disintegration of the Western Empire, or is the political disintegration caused by the economic hardship that's going on?
How does the correlation run? That's a good question. Incidentally, the decay and the decline is also visible in the East, but it doesn't fall as far,
Yeah.
and then at least parts of it go back up, and not necessarily as a whole. But so it's certainly something that hits the Roman Empire writ large. But
Yeah.
anyway, as to your question of the political aspect of all of this, how does the correlation run, and how do you even establish that? Well, it's very hard to say. And what triggers the whole thing? What triggers the unraveling? It's certainly the case that political instability is having a negative effect. Because political stability, what does the state mostly do? What the state mostly does in terms of where it puts its resources is the military. Well, the Roman state is largely an army. Most of its resources go to the military. And what does the military do? Well, for the most part, protect the empire. Well, these legions are stationed on the far outer edges, on the Danube and on the Rhine, and in the east, like holding back the Parthians. You see political grumbling, a political decline, and infighting, and usurpers, and that leads to military weaknesses, and you get barbarian invasions, and you get like the Parthians overrunning some like Eastern Roman provinces. But what is causing that? Is that the economy declining? Is it the case that very many people died in the Antonine Plague, and therefore very many taxpayers died? And that is where the Roman Empire didn't borrow money, right? It's something that tends to heavily confuse my students. The Roman Empire did not borrow. What it got in, it had to pay out. And if stuff is not coming in, you can't pay the soldiers, right? So is it the case that taxpayers are dying and there's a fiscal crisis, and that leads to military weakness, and that leads to political instability, it all seems to be sort of one entangled mess. It's very hard to disentangle this, and to point at one thing is like aha, so to answer your question, it might not be a very satisfactory answer, but it kind of runs both ways.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Let me give you some of the audience questions before we
Please.
run totally out of time, because there's some interesting ones. The first one, I think actually you've spoken to the general topic, but I'll ask the question that's there, which is, haven't we underestimated Mediterranean trade networks prior to the Roman Empire? And wasn't trade actually quite extensive during the Bronze Age?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. No, so this is what I find personally interesting about this shipwreck. What's fascinating about it is that it shows the Roman peak. Fantastic, fabulous. But if you look at the very long term, you already see in the Bronze Age, and that was the question, you already see, and this is not background noise, and you see it going up. But the Bronze Age too is a period of state formation.
Mm-hmm.
This is when pristine state formation starts in the southeastern quadrants of the Mediterranean world. And after the Bronze Age collapse, after say 1200 BC, I mean the data are few, but you do seem to see in that long-term graph that it then declines. And in the Iron Age, when state formation begins anew, it starts to go up again. So there does seem to be that correlation between, on one hand, state formation and whatever it is that states do, being positive for long distance trade. So the person who asked the question is, yeah, absolutely, there is trade during the Bronze Age, and the trade like throughout. And you don't technically need states, but I personally do find it interesting that you see this thousands of years correlation between state formation, states getting stronger, and long distance trade increasing. Again, if we take shipwrecks as a proxy. Let's just do that for argument's sake.
Great, great. Another question from someone else in the audience, which I'll condense a bit because it's got sort of a long section to it. It says, the subject matter of your books reveals that people from different religions and cultures can coexist in peace through international trade, provided they're sophisticated, stable, and enduring underlying political infrastructure and networks. Today, the questioner says, the liberal world order is nearing collapse. But there seems to be a new multipolar order emerging amongst members of the global South. So what can history teach us about, quote unquote, geopolitical convergence through international trade? And what lessons might we derive from the ancient world about such geopolitical convergence?
Oh dear.
Yeah.
I wish I had a good answer to that. In terms of, well, I guess the most important part of that question is what can we learn, right? What's the lesson to be drawn from this? And I think the most important lesson to be drawn, and this might sound cliched, but I'm going to say it anyway, is trust. Like these networks are based on trust. Trust of your own network, but also trust in the other, like in the other networks doing their part and sort of, you know, keeping their house in order. Trust in society. Roman society is, yes, backed up by hard power, but the Roman Empire is not a military dictatorship, you know, South America style in 1970s. It's soft power. There is a certain trust in the authorities. And I don't want to gloss over like all the terrible things about the Empire, like slavery and inequality, but there is something about this empire being held together by some form of glue that goes beyond hard power, soft power, call it trust. And I think that's the most important lesson. We are losing that. That way, we're losing trust in institutions, we're losing trust in governments, we're losing trust in the news media. We're losing trust in the other in a very sort of visceral, you know, way, your neighbor. And that is very dangerous. And this is, in my view, why the liberal world order is in decline. And how to bring that back. This should be at the forefront of our minds. Like what can we learn from the past? How do you do that? Yeah, in the case of the Roman Empire, somehow being functional and somehow producing something of benefit, something tangible that people see. That must, as abstract as that sounds, that must be the answer somehow. I'm not sure if that was very, I'm not sure if I satisfied the person who asked the question. But
I mean, I think it's in some ways the $1 million question, but it's also a really difficult one to have any simple answer for. I mean, one thing that strikes me actually about some of this is if we think about the early days of the internet and the early development of the internet, in some ways that was like the long distance trading networks of the Mediterranean that you've been talking about. That
yeah.
If we think, back to the 1970s, 1980s, very early 1990s, the way that the internet was structured and governed was not altogether different from olive oil traders in Carthage and
yeah. So largely self-policing, and it worked. It doesn't anymore. I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah, just look at the comments on any of the videos that we
I haven't. I'm curious to see what the comments on this one will be.
I'm sure that in fact we've not had a problem with bad comments on the center's videos, but I think anytime anybody puts a video content up online or any other kind of content online, if there are comments, frequently the comments can degenerate because this policing memechanism has broken down on some level, and yeah, I don't know why that is, but it's,
which comes down to trust. Like ultimately, it comes down to trust in institutions, trust in, again, the news media, trust in society. Yeah.
Here's another interesting kind of conceptual question from someone in the audience who says, speaking of the type of growth, whether Smithian or Schumpeterian, what about the type of economic system? And the specific question is, could we then possibly classify the Roman Empire as some kind of proto-capitalism or not?
Yeah, that is has been a much debated question. The Roman Empire had markets, right? This one nobody doubts. There's a market for olive oil, there's markets for grain, there's markets for like higher-end products too. Does that make it a capitalist society? And that's a question I guess we need to define a capitalist society. If we define capitalism and a capitalist society as the mindset writ large in society being to invest to make more money, to be materially better off, then the answer arguably is no, despite the fact that there are markets, because very many of the richest people, the aristocrats who own so much of the capital, mostly land, seem little interested in that. They lead a lifestyle of luxury and leisure. And you don't see sort of capitalists, like people investing in ventures so that they might, grow their wealth. So in that sense, so despite the fact that there are markets, to call it capitalist society would be a stretch. At the same time, it's not like we don't see that at all. So it is a matter of degree, and are there gray scales of capitalism? Can you be something in between? That's a difficult discussion to have. But that anyway, that there are market forces at work in the Roman Empire, this is beyond doubt.
Okay, so I think that's pretty much all of the questions from the audience. There are a couple of others which I could pose that are kind of twists on earlier questions. One being actually an interesting one here is also an audience question, but a twist on an earlier audience question as well. So wasn't the late Bronze Age with fragmented states more innovative than the Roman Empire, right? The introduction of horses, the development of chariots, all of these rapid and lighter two-wheel vehicles. Isn't there a plethora of examples of great innovation from that period? I mean, we've been talking about sort of the Middle Ages and early modern period as innovative because of this fragmentation. Isn't the earlier period also more innovative?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I understand we have a Bronze Age scholar in Jonas.
Yeah.
I never thought of that, but I think that case could be made because yes, the Bronze Age is very innovative. Yeah, the chariot has been mentioned. Bronze making itself, right? You need copper and tin, put them together in the right amounts to even create bronze. Forms of architecture. Is that a result of, or is that tied to the Bronze Age being very fragmented? Yeah, I think that case could be made. Again, I have to think that through. It never really occurred to me, but yeah, I think that case could be made. Yeah, but I'd have to think that through a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting thesis, I think, as a general proposition that sort of political fragmentation breeds Schumpeterian growth, but hurts Smithian growth, whereas political unitary politics or kind of imperial domination or strong states generally promote Smithian growth, but hurt Schumpeterian.
Yeah. We can think of writing too. I mean, writing is an invention of the Bronze Age. Can we tie that to sort of interstate competition? Well, I have to think that through, but I think a case could be made. Yeah, that this is an argument that extends backward in time until pristine state formation really in the Bronze Age. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder if it extends even more generally, across different parts of the world, different periods of history, to think about kind of innovation versus sort of security and predictable sort of geometric growth versus exponential growth or punctuated exponential growth. That could happen in these different kinds of contexts, and the trade-off, therefore, between certain kinds of politics and certain kinds of economic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and I guess, because we have now gone on more than an hour, I'll just ask very briefly to Taka, was there anything else that you would like to talk about or mention that we haven't had a chance?
No, I think we've covered all of my hobby horses. So no, not really, no.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very, very much for doing this and for coming on. It's been really, really informative for me, and I'm sure also for our audience, almost all of whom have stayed with us actually throughout the whole time and even a bit over time. So thank you to everyone who's attended, and thank you, Taka, once again. And
thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
Thanks very much, and good noontime, afternoon, or late evening, depending on where in the world you are. To everyone.
It's 11:30.
Noontime for you,
Noontime.
late
Yeah.
afternoon for me, early evening, very late evening, I suspect, if anyone is watching us in Asia, which I'm not sure anyone is, but if they are, then so thank you, everyone, and goodbye.